The laughter had already started before I even stood up, and that alone told me this was going to be a long afternoon. My name is Mira Whitlock, and I am the only human cadet in a room full of officers from 4 different star systems, all of them staring at a laminated old bow like it was some kind of joke, pulled from a history book nobody bothered to finish reading. Instructor Korath Ven held it up between 2 long fingers, turning it slowly so the light caught the curve of the limbs. He was Vakari, tall and pale gray, with eyes that could switch between 3 different colors depending on his mood. Right now they were amused yellow. "Does anyone recognize this primitive human artifact?" he asked the room. A cadet named Dressel Kor, built like a wall with arms twice the size of mine, leaned forward and squinted at it like it might explain itself. "A ranged weapon," he said. "No power cell, no targeting computer, just a stick and a string. How did your species ever survive long enough to reach the stars with tools like this?" The room laughed again, louder this time. I sat at the back with my arms crossed and said nothing, because I have learned that the best way to win a room like this is to let them dig their own hole first and hand them the shovel. Instructor Ven set the bow back on its display stand, like it was something fragile and outdated, a fossil best admired from a safe distance. "It is, in fact, a museum piece," he said. "We keep it here for historical context. Before your species reached true civilization, weapons like this were how conflicts were settled." That word made my jaw tighten. Museum piece. As if my grandmother's hands and my grandfather's hands and every hand before them, going back further than any written record, had held something that belonged behind glass, instead of something still very much alive. "Cadet Whitlock," Ven said, his eyes sliding toward me. "You have been unusually quiet. Do you have anything to add about your species' historical relationship with this weapon?" I stood up slowly. Every head in the amphitheater turned toward me, and for a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the ventilation system somewhere above us. "Can I hold it?" I asked. Ven hesitated, then passed it over, like he was handing me something borrowed from a temple. I turned it in my hands and felt something settle in my chest, a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in months. The limbs were fiberglass, the riser aluminum, nothing exotic, nothing rare. It had already been strung, which told me the display crew had no idea what they were doing, because leaving a bow strung for months on end slowly ruins it. But that was a problem for another day. "You'll need a target," I said. The room went still in that particular way. Rooms go still right before something happens that nobody planned for. Ven's eyes flickered toward the tall windows at the back of the amphitheater, which looked out onto the training range. Standard silhouette targets stood at various distances out there, used for hand-to-hand assessment drills and marksmanship testing with modern weapons. "That will do," I said, and walked toward the door before anyone could stop me or talk me out of it. I should explain something here, because I think it matters. I had not touched a bow in almost a year. Officer training does not leave much room for anything outside of simulations, tactics classes, and endless hours studying alien diplomatic protocol. But my grandmother put a bow in my hands when I was 6 years old, standing behind me in a field just outside our village, guiding my elbow with her palm, and telling me to breathe out before I ever thought about letting go. Some things live in your hands and shoulders long after your mind has stopped thinking about them every day. Outside, the wind was light, barely worth noticing. I picked an arrow from the display quiver, which had clearly never been used for anything except decoration, checked the fletching for damage, and found none. 40 meters away stood the nearest silhouette target, the kind used to test how quickly a cadet could disable a threat during simulation drills. 40 meters. That is nothing. That is barely a conversation's distance. Behind me, the cadets had followed out onto the range, and I could feel their curiosity pressing against my back like a physical thing. Dressel stood near the front with his arms crossed, clearly expecting very little. I knocked the arrow, drew it back until my hand found the familiar anchor point at the corner of my mouth, and let my breath out slow and even, exactly the way my grandmother taught me a lifetime ago. The world around me went quiet in the way it always does in that half second before release, like the whole universe is holding its breath along with you. I let go. The arrow crossed the distance almost faster than the eye could follow, and struck the center of the target with a solid, satisfying thud that seemed to echo across the entire range. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody said anything at all. I reached for a second arrow, nocked it, and this time aimed for a much smaller mark near the top of the silhouette, no larger than the width of 2 fingers pressed together. I drew, breathed, and released. The second arrow landed less than an inch from the first shot's neighbor mark, exactly where I meant it to go. "That could be luck," Dressel said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. "Then you try," I said, and held the bow out toward him. He took it carefully, clearly unsure how to hold something that had no buttons, no screen, no automatic stabilizer. Vakari are strong, far stronger than any human, and he pulled the string back with obvious effort, his arm shaking slightly under a tension his muscles were not used to working against in this particular way. His first arrow buried itself in the dirt several meters short of the target. His second glanced off the wooden frame entirely and skittered away across the range. A few cadets who had laughed loudest at me earlier were now laughing at him, and I felt a small twinge of sympathy, though not enough to stop me from making my point. "A rifle's targeting computer does most of the thinking for you," I said, taking the bow back gently. "This does not think for you at all. Every part of the work happens in your body, your breath, your hands, your eyes. That is not primitive. That is simply a different kind of relationship between a person and a tool." I looked around at the circle of faces, human and otherwise, all watching me now with something that had shifted from amusement into genuine attention. "My ancestors used bows like this one for more than 10,000 years, I continued. They used them to hunt, to protect their homes, to feed their families, long before anyone on my planet had ever built an engine or a computer chip. And here is the part I think gets missed. We never stopped. Long after we built starships and plasma weapons and machines that can think faster than any of us, people back home still pick up a bow like this one for sport, for tradition, to teach their children patience and focus. It is not something we outgrew. It is something we kept, right alongside everything new we built." Instructor Venn had been silent through all of this, his eyes now a deep, thoughtful blue instead of their earlier amused yellow. He studied the 2 arrows still standing in the target, close enough together that you could have covered both with a single hand. "I believe," he said slowly, "we will be revising the description on that display case." "Tell them it is still in use," I said, walking back to hand him the bow properly, grip first, the way my grandmother had taught me to pass one to someone else. "Tell them it never stopped being one." That evening in the dining hall, something small but noticeable happened. Dressel sat down across from me, instead of at his usual table on the far side of the room. 10,000 years, he said, turning the number over slowly, like he was searching for its edges, trying to understand a span of time that large. "And your people never set it aside, not even once." "We never needed to," I said. "Some tools do not become useless just because better ones come along. They just end up with company." He nodded slowly, and for the rest of the meal we talked about small things, training schedules, the strange food in the mess hall, nothing important, but it felt like something had shifted quietly between us. Word of what happened on the range spread through the academy faster than I expected. By the next morning, cadets I had never spoken to were asking quiet questions about the bow, about my grandmother, about whether such a simple weapon could really compete with anything modern. I answered what I could, and let the rest stay mine. A few days later, I walked past the display case in the main hall, and stopped without meaning to. The old bow sat exactly where it always had, but the placard beside it had changed. It no longer called it a primitive artifact from a species working its way toward true civilization. It simply read that this weapon, first developed by ancient humans, remained in active use to this day, valued not for what it lacked but for what it demanded from the person holding it. I stood there a long moment, thinking about my grandmother's hands guiding mine in that field so many years ago, about breath and patience, and the quiet space between drawing a string and letting it go. Some lessons, it turns out, travel a very long way, even out among the stars, and some tools never stop mattering, no matter how far you go from home.